The signal came through at 3 in the morning, Earth time. The communication center at the United Nations headquarters in New York detected it first, a desperate cry cutting through the vast emptiness of space. The message was being repeated over and over, getting weaker and stronger in turns, as if whoever was sending it wasn't sure if anyone was listening. The technician on duty, a young man named Kevin, listened to the garbled words and felt his heart begin to race. This wasn't a routine transmission. This wasn't normal traffic between galactic stations. This was something different. This was someone begging for help. Kevin immediately contacted his supervisor, a woman named Rachel who had been working in space communications for 15 years. Rachel came to his station and listened to the message 3 times before she understood the full weight of what they were hearing. "Get me the director," Rachel said, her voice steady but urgent. "And get me a translation running on this. Full analysis. I need to know exactly what they're saying." Within minutes, the entire communication center was alive with activity. The message was being translated from an alien language that the computer had to work to decode. But slowly, word by word, the meaning became clear. It was a distress call. An alien civilization, or perhaps multiple civilizations working together, was under attack. They were losing. They were desperate. And they were calling out to humanity for help. "We are the Meridian Alliance," the message said, the translation software converting the alien phonetics into English words. "We are under attack by the Void Swarm. Our military is failing. Our defenses are crumbling. Send anyone. Send your warriors, your leaders, your strategists. Humanity, if you receive this, we need your forces immediately. We need them now. Please." The message looped again and again, each repetition carrying the weight of desperation, the sound of a civilization facing extinction. Rachel made a decision. She authorized the highest priority alert, routing the message directly to the United Nations Security Council, to the president of every nation on Earth, to every military command center. Within 30 minutes, every major leader on the planet knew what was happening. Within an hour, an emergency session of the United Nations had been called. The Secretary General, a woman named Patricia from Kenya, sat at the head of the long table in the Security Council chamber. Around her sat representatives from every major nation, their faces pale with shock and concern. The message played on speakers throughout the room, that desperate alien voice calling out across the stars for help. "We have to do something," said Ambassador Henry from the United Kingdom, his voice urgent. "They're asking for our help. We can't ignore that." "But we don't know what we're facing," countered General Robert from the United States Military Command. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man trained to think strategically about war. "We don't know who these aliens are. We don't know how many of them there are. We don't know if sending our military would help or if it would be throwing our people away." Earth had only joined the galactic community 3 years ago, when human scientists had finally proven that faster-than-light travel was possible and that the universe was filled with other intelligent civilizations. For those 3 years, humanity had been treated with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism by the older, more advanced species. The human species was young. Humans had only just left their own solar system. Humans had no experience with the kind of conflicts that existed in galactic space. But now, those more advanced civilizations were begging for help. They were asking humanity to come to their aid. It was both an honor and a terrible responsibility. "We need more information," said Secretary General Patricia. "Send a message back to the Meridian Alliance. Tell them we're listening. Ask them to provide details about what they're facing. We need to understand the situation before we can decide what to do." A response came back within 40 minutes. The Meridian Alliance explained that they were a coalition of multiple species, each of them ancient and advanced, but together they were facing something unprecedented. The Void Swarm was an enemy unlike anything they had encountered before. It was not a traditional military force. It was not an organized government seeking to expand its territory. Instead, it was a consuming force, a biological plague that moved through space destroying everything in its path. The Void Swarm consisted of creatures that had no interest in diplomacy, no concept of negotiation, no ability to be reasoned with. They simply consumed. They destroyed. They moved forward like a natural disaster, unstoppable and total in their destruction. The Meridian Alliance had been fighting them for 6 months. 6 months of constant warfare. 6 months of losing ground, losing fleets, losing entire worlds. "We have casualties numbering in the hundreds of millions," the message said. "We have lost 3 complete military fleets. We have lost control of 15 planets. If we cannot find a way to stop this advance, the Meridian Alliance will cease to exist within 2 weeks. We will be extinct." Everything we have built across thousands of years will be gone. We are asking humanity to send whatever forces you can spare. Send your best warriors. Send your best strategists. Send your best weapons. Send anything. Anything at all. Please. General Robert looked at the message and felt the weight of it pressing down on him. This was real. This was not a test or a simulation. This was an actual alien civilization facing actual extinction, and they were asking humanity to help them. If we send military forces, we're committing ourselves to a war in space, Robert said slowly. We're committing ourselves to protecting another species against an enemy we don't fully understand. If we fail, we could be putting humanity at risk. And if we don't send help, what does that say about us? Asked Ambassador Helen from France. Her voice was quiet but firm. What does it say about humanity if we turn away when someone is asking for help? Especially when that someone is an entire civilization facing extinction. The debate went on for hours. Some representatives wanted to send military forces immediately. Others wanted to be cautious, to learn more before committing. Some argued that humanity was too young, too inexperienced, to take on such a massive responsibility. Others argued that refusing to help would damage Earth's reputation in the galactic community. Finally, Secretary General Patricia made a decision. We will send military forces, she said. We will send our best units, our most experienced commanders, our most advanced weapons. We will show the galaxy what humanity can do when we're needed. Orders were sent out immediately to military commands around the world. Preparations began to select and train the soldiers who would be sent to fight in an alien war. Transport ships were being prepared. Equipment was being loaded. Soldiers were being briefed on what they might face. But in the chaos of all this activity, in the confusion of military preparation and government decision-making, something unexpected happened. The distress signal from the Meridian Alliance was being routed through multiple communication networks. One of those networks was civilian. One of those signals was being received by ordinary people, not just military commanders and government officials. An email arrived in the inbox of someone who was never supposed to receive it. Someone whose life was about to change in ways that nobody could have predicted. Someone who would shortly make a decision that would alter the course of galactic history. That person was an old woman named Margaret, and she was sitting at her computer in a small house in Vancouver, Canada, reading the message that should never have reached her. Margaret Chin sat at her computer for a long time after reading the distress message. The words kept repeating in her mind. Send anyone. Send your warriors, your leaders, your strategists. Humanity, if you receive this, we need your forces immediately. The message was clear. The need was urgent. The situation was desperate. But what Margaret noticed most of all was the word anyone. Not generals. Not politicians. Not military commanders. Just anyone. She thought about her life. She was 78 years old. She had been a schoolteacher for 40 years, teaching English and literature to teenagers in Vancouver. She had raised 2 children and now had 5 grandchildren. She had a comfortable life, a quiet life. She had a pension. She had a small house with a garden. She had spent most of her adult years doing exactly what was expected of her, playing by the rules, being careful, being sensible. But she had also spent 78 years being angry. She was angry about injustice. She was angry about suffering. She was angry about people who hurt others and faced no consequences. She had channeled that anger into her teaching, into trying to make her students think critically about the world, into trying to help them become better people. But there was still anger left inside her, anger that had never found a real outlet, anger that had been waiting for something like this. Margaret stood up from her computer and walked to her kitchen. From a drawer filled with old cooking utensils, she pulled out a rolling pin. It was made of worn wood, darkened by decades of use. It had belonged to her grandmother, brought from China more than 80 years ago. Margaret had used it to roll dough for dumplings, to make noodles, to create food for her family. She had also used it to discipline her grandchildren when they misbehaved, a gentle tap on the head to get their attention. She held the rolling pin in her hand and made a decision. Margaret sat back down at her computer and began to search through the Earth government's official websites. She found information about individual response rights to galactic distress calls. It was a law that had been established when Earth joined the galactic community, allowing private citizens to respond to emergency calls if they filed the proper paperwork. Most people thought it was a meaningless law, something that would never actually be used. But it existed, and according to the legal description, Margaret had the right to invoke it. She spent the next 3 hours filling out paperwork. She filed a request for individual response to a galactic distress call. She booked passage on a transport ship that was heading out to the Meridian Alliance's command station. She packed a small bag with clothes and toiletries. She left a note for her daughter explaining what she had done. By the time her daughter called her the next morning, Margaret was already at the spaceport, waiting to board the transport ship. "Mom, what are you doing?" her daughter, a woman named Elizabeth, asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and panic. "I got your note. You can't just go to space. You're 78 years old." "I know how old I am," Margaret said calmly. "And yes, I can. The law allows it." "But why?" Elizabeth asked. "Why would you do this? You have grandchildren here. You have a life here." Margaret thought about that question. How could she explain to her daughter that she was tired of having a small life? That she was tired of being careful? That she was tired of watching the world suffer and doing nothing significant about it? "Because they asked for help," Margaret said simply. "And I can give it. So I'm going to." The argument went on for another 10 minutes, but Margaret held firm. She was an adult. She had made her decision. She was getting on that ship. The transport ship was enormous, designed to carry hundreds of passengers and thousands of tons of cargo. Margaret was one of only 40 human passengers aboard. The others were mostly military personnel heading to join Earth's forces in the Galactic War. They stared at the elderly woman boarding the ship with her small bag and her wooden rolling pin. None of them understood why an old woman was traveling to a war zone. For the next 3 weeks, Margaret spent most of her time in her small cabin aboard the transport ship. She watched the stars pass by through the viewport, watched Earth grow smaller and smaller until it was nothing but a blue dot in the vast darkness of space. She thought about her grandchildren. She thought about all the times in her life when she had wanted to do something big, something important, something that would matter. And she had never done it. She had always settled for something smaller. Now, at 78 years old, with her life more than 3/4 over, she was finally doing something big. When the transport ship arrived at the Meridian Alliance's command station, Margaret felt a surge of nervousness that she hadn't experienced in decades. This was real. She was actually here. She was actually going to do this. She gathered her small bag and her rolling pin, gripping them tightly, and made her way to the docking bay. The command station was like nothing Margaret had ever seen before. It was enormous, a structure that seemed to be built from multiple materials, all of them gleaming with light. There were sections that seemed to be made of crystal, sections that looked like polished metal, sections that appeared to be made of something alive, something that pulsed with a gentle bioluminescence. The station hung in orbit around one of the Meridian Alliance's homeworlds, and the view of the planet from the viewport was breathtaking. It was a world of multiple colors, with great swirling storms in its atmosphere, with oceans and continents and cities that gleamed like jewels. When Margaret disembarked from the transport ship, a docking officer was waiting for her. The officer was a tall being made of what looked like crystalline blue material. It was shaped roughly like a humanoid, but its body seemed to shift and shimmer in the light, reflecting it in ways that hurt Margaret's eyes to look at directly. The being stared at Margaret with what she assumed was confusion, though it was hard to read expressions on a face made of crystal. "You are the human response?" the being asked, its voice sounding like the sound of ice cracking and shifting. "I am," Margaret said simply. Her voice was steady, though her hands were shaking slightly. "I'm here to help with the void swarm problem." The crystalline being made a sound that might have been laughter. "Come with me," it said. "The council is waiting. Though I suspect they will not be pleased with what Earth has sent." Margaret followed the crystalline being through the corridors of the command station. She passed beings of every conceivable description. Some were humanoid like herself. Some were insectoid with many legs and multiple eyes. Some were gaseous entities contained within force fields. Some were things that Margaret couldn't even begin to categorize or understand. They all stared at her as she passed, this tiny old woman walking through their station with a small bag and a wooden rolling pin. She could feel their confusion. She could sense their doubt. But Margaret didn't care what they thought. She had traveled through space to get here. She had made her choice. Now she was going to see it through no matter what happened next. 3 days had passed since Margaret arrived at the command station. 3 days of meetings with alien military officers who couldn't believe that an old human woman was suggesting they change their entire military strategy. 3 days of arguments and debates and careful explanations. But in the end, they had agreed to try her plan. They had nothing left to lose. Now, Margaret stood in the command center, watching the battle unfold on the tactical displays. The holographic screens showed the vast expanse of space controlled by the Meridian Alliance, the positions of their military forces, and the advancing cloud of the void swarm. The enemy moved through space like a plague of locusts, consuming everything in their path. The Meridian Alliance had followed Margaret's strategy exactly. They had abandoned 3 key sectors, pulling their forces back in what appeared to be a disorganized retreat. The Void Swarm, seeing what they perceived as weakness, had pressed forward eagerly, spreading their forces across a wider and wider area of space. Their supply lines, which had been relatively compact and efficient when they were moving as a unified force, were now stretched thin across millions of kilometers. "It's working," said Commander Krell, the insectoid officer whose laughter Margaret had heard 3 days ago when she first arrived. His tone was different now. There was respect in his voice. There was understanding. He had watched the battle unfold according to Margaret's predictions, and he had begun to comprehend the brilliance of what she had suggested. "Their coordination is falling apart," added Officer Patricia, the human liaison who had become Margaret's closest ally on the command station. She pointed at different sections of the tactical display. "Look here. Their communication network is breaking down. Here, their supply ships are being separated from their combat forces. And here, their forward units are pushing ahead without proper backup support." Margaret nodded, studying the display with intense concentration. She was tired. She had barely slept in 3 days, spending most of her time either in the command center or in briefing sessions with various alien military officers. But her mind was still sharp, still focused on the strategic problems laid out before her. An alarm suddenly sounded throughout the command center. Officers at various stations looked up from their consoles, their attention suddenly diverted to a new problem. On the tactical display, a section of the Meridian Alliance's defensive line in Sector 7 had turned red, indicating a breach. "We have a problem," said a Catharian officer named Vincent. His species looked roughly humanoid, with skin that shifted between shades of green and purple. He was pointing at the display with growing alarm. "The Void Swarm has broken through the defensive line at Sector 7. They're moving deeper into Alliance space." Margaret's heart sank. She moved closer to the display, studying the situation. The Void Swarm forces had indeed broken through a weak point in the defensive line. They were now moving toward what the display labeled as a civilian population center. She touched the display, bringing up information about the sector. The numbers were devastating. The civilian population center in Sector 7 contained over 50 million inhabitants. 50 million people. 50 million lives. According to the evacuation plan that had been established, the Meridian Alliance had expected to move the majority of the population to safety before the Void Swarm arrived. But something had gone wrong. Something had delayed the evacuation process. Only a quarter of the population had managed to escape before the enemy forces arrived. That meant 37.5 million people were still trapped in that sector. "We need to send forces there immediately," said General Marcus, a human military officer who had been sent to assist in the coordination between Earth forces and the Meridian Alliance military. His voice was urgent, desperate. "We can't just abandon those people. We have to defend them." Margaret knew what sending forces to defend Sector 7 would mean. It would disrupt her entire strategy. The trap that she had so carefully constructed, the plan that had been working perfectly, would fall apart. The Void Swarm forces that were separated and weakened would have to be reunited, brought back together to mount a coordinated defense. The advantage that the Meridian Alliance had gained would be lost. But there were 37.5 million people in that sector. 37.5 million people who were going to die if something wasn't done to help them. Margaret looked around the command center. All eyes were on her. The officers, the aliens of various species, the humans who had traveled here from Earth, they all seemed to be waiting for her decision. After 3 days of following her strategy, they had come to see her as a leader, as someone who understood this kind of warfare, as someone who could make the hard decisions. "I'm going there," Margaret said quietly. "What?" Commander Krell asked, his multiple eyes focusing on her with confusion. "Send me to Sector 7, Margaret continued. "Send me on a shuttle with minimal escort. Just enough to get me to the civilian center. Not a full military force. Not soldiers. Just me." "You cannot fight a battle," said the crystalline being who had first escorted Margaret through the command station. "You are too old. You are too weak. You are human. You would be killed immediately." "I know," Margaret said calmly. "But I'm not going there to fight. I'm going there to do something else. I'm going there to lead. I'm going there to organize. I'm going there to show those people that they can survive." Officer Patricia stepped forward. "I'll go with you," she said. "I'm trained in military operations. I can help." "No," Margaret said firmly. "You stay here. You coordinate with the command center. You keep the strategy on track. That's more important. I need you here. General Marcus started to protest. This is insane. You're an old woman. You can't. I can, Margaret interrupted. And I will. That's my decision. Within an hour, Margaret was on a shuttle heading toward Sector 7. The journey took 40 minutes. During that time, Margaret sat in the small cabin and watched the stars pass by. She thought about her grandchildren. She thought about her life. She thought about all the time she had been careful, all the time she had played it safe, all the time she had let other people take the risks. Now it was her turn. Now she was the one taking the risk. And somehow that felt right. When the shuttle arrived at the civilian population center in Sector 7, it was chaos. The evacuation had been partially successful, but 50 million people moving at once created confusion and panic. The shelters that had been built to house the population were overcrowded. Power systems were failing. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. And outside the shelters, the void swarm was advancing, destroying everything in its path. Margaret disembarked from the shuttle with her rolling pin tucked under her arm. A young officer named Robert, who had come with her as part of the minimal escort, stared at her in amazement. "This way," Robert said, leading her toward the main shelter complex. "We need to get you to safety." The void swarm creatures could breach the outer walls at any time. But Margaret wasn't thinking about safety. She was thinking about 50 million people who were terrified, who were trapped, who needed someone to tell them what to do and how to survive. She was thinking about the anger that had been building inside her for 78 years, and how finally, it had found a purpose. She walked into the main shelter and looked at the sea of faces surrounding her. Alien faces. Human faces. Faces of every conceivable species, all of them terrified, all of them looking for hope. Margaret raised her rolling pin. She took a deep breath. And she began to give orders. Margaret spent 12 hours organizing the civilian population center in Sector 7. She moved through the shelters with her cane, her rolling pin tucked under her arm, giving orders and making decisions. She had the strongest people move supplies from overcrowded areas to places where they were needed more. She had the technical people work on restoring power to critical systems. She had the medical people set up triage areas where the injured and sick could be treated. She had the teachers and caregivers keep the children calm and occupied. Everyone listened to her. There was something in her bearing, something in the way she moved and spoke, that commanded respect and attention. She was an old woman, yes. She was small and fragile, yes. But she carried herself with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. When the void swarm creatures finally breached the outer walls and began to pour into the shelter complex, Margaret did something that shocked everyone. She walked directly toward the advancing creatures. Officer Robert tried to stop her, but Margaret held up her hand and kept walking. She faced down the massive biomass creatures with nothing but her rolling pin and her absolute refusal to be afraid. She hit one of the creatures with her rolling pin. It was not a hard blow, not really, but the creature seemed confused by the action. It paused. It hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, the defense forces arrived and drove the creatures back. The breach was sealed. The civilian population was saved. After that moment, Margaret became something more than just a military advisor. She became a symbol. She became proof that courage and determination could matter even in the face of overwhelming odds. And when she returned to the command station, she returned as a hero. Over the next 10 days, the strategy that Margaret had outlined began to come together perfectly. The void swarm, spread thin across a vast area of space, became increasingly vulnerable. Their supply lines, already stretched and fragile, began to fail completely. The ships that were supposed to carry food and fuel and ammunition to the forward units were being cut off by Meridian Alliance forces. The creatures that made up the void swarm began to slow down. Their aggression became less coordinated. Their movements became less certain. Margaret worked from the command center, monitoring the battle, watching as her strategy played out across the tactical displays. She had a small team of officers who reported directly to her. There was Commander Krell, the insectoid officer whose laughter had turned to respect. There was Officer Patricia, the human who had become her closest ally. There was Vincent, the Catharian whose purple-green skin seemed to shift whenever he was thinking hard about a problem. There was the crystalline being whose name Margaret could never quite pronounce but who had become an excellent tactical advisor. And there were others, representatives from different species, different worlds, different perspectives, all of them unified in their commitment to following Margaret's strategy. Margaret moved through the command center with her cane, pointing out weaknesses in enemy formations, suggesting tactical adjustments. She pushed the Meridian Alliance forces to be more aggressive, to take more risks, to press their advantage when they saw it opening up. "There," she said, pointing at a section of the tactical display with her rolling pin. "See how the Void Swarm's left flank is exposed? That's where we need to strike. That's where they're vulnerable." Commander Krell studied the display, his multiple eyes considering the situation from different angles. "If we attack there, we expose our own forces," he said carefully. "Exactly," Margaret replied. "We accept that risk because they're more exposed than we are. We're making a trade. We're accepting some damage in order to cause more damage to them. That's how you win against an enemy that's larger than you are." Over the course of the 10 days, the Meridian Alliance won battle after battle. They weren't crushing victories. The Void Swarm was still a formidable enemy. But each victory gave them momentum. Each victory pushed the invaders farther back. Each victory made it clearer that the tide was turning. But there was a cost. Soldiers died. Ships were destroyed. Worlds that had been in the path of the Void Swarm were left as burned-out husks, their populations either evacuated or lost. Margaret watched the casualties mount with a heavy heart. She had made the strategic decisions. She had advised the military commanders. The blood was on her hands in a way. But she also understood that the alternative was worse. If they didn't defeat the Void Swarm, everyone would die. All the civilizations of the Meridian Alliance would be extinct. "You are thinking too much about the cost," Officer Patricia said to her one day. She found Margaret standing alone in a small observation room, looking out at the stars. "You did what had to be done." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "But that doesn't make it easier to accept. When you're a teacher, you spend your whole life trying to help people, trying to save them from harm. Now I'm making decisions that result in people dying. Millions of people dying. To save billions," Patricia said. "Without your strategy, the Meridian Alliance would have been destroyed. Everyone would be dead. You didn't choose to make people suffer. You chose to minimize the suffering." Margaret nodded slowly. She understood that logically. But understanding something logically and feeling right about it emotionally were two very different things. By the 8th day of the campaign, the Void Swarm's situation had become dire. Their main supply chain had been cut. Their forward units were running low on resources. Their creatures were becoming slower, weaker, less aggressive. The Meridian Alliance forces, meanwhile, were growing stronger with each passing day. Reinforcements were arriving from across the Alliance. New ships were being deployed. Soldiers were being reinforced with fresh troops. Margaret stood in the command center and watched as the noose tightened around the Void Swarm. She could see it on the tactical display, could see how the enemy was being slowly crushed by forces that were coordinated, that understood strategy, that were willing to make the hard decisions necessary to win. "They're beginning to break," said Vincent, pointing at sections of the display where Void Swarm forces were beginning to retreat rather than advance. "Their cohesion is failing." "It's almost over," Margaret said quietly. She could feel it. After weeks of fighting, after days of careful strategic maneuvering, the end was finally in sight. On the 10th day, the Void Swarm made one last desperate push. They gathered whatever forces they had left and launched a massive assault on the Meridian Alliance's core defensive positions. It was a gamble, an all-or-nothing attempt to break through and reach the heart of the Alliance before they were completely destroyed. Margaret watched the battle unfold on the displays. She saw the Void Swarm forces advancing, overwhelming the first defensive line, pressing toward the second. For a moment she thought they might break through. For a moment, it looked like everything was going to fall apart. Then she made a decision. She authorized the release of the reserve force that she had held back for exactly this kind of moment. A combined fleet of Meridian Alliance ships and human vessels from Earth, all of them coordinated, all of them ready. They cut through the Void Swarm's advancing force with precision and power, not engaging in traditional combat but instead moving with speed and purpose, striking at the exact weak points that Margaret had identified. The Void Swarm force collapsed. The creatures, separated from their main body and deprived of supplies, began to retreat. The Meridian Alliance forces pursued them, driving them back out of Alliance space, hunting them into the far reaches of known space until the last of the invaders was either dead or had fled beyond the ability of the Alliance to follow. By the time the battle was truly over, Margaret was asleep in her quarters. She had worked for 38 hours straight without rest. When she woke up, it was to the sound of celebrations throughout the command station. The Void Swarm had been defeated. The Meridian Alliance had been saved. And the elderly human woman who had arrived just weeks ago had become the most celebrated military strategist in galactic history. Margaret Chin became a legend. Within days of the Void Swarm's defeat, news of her extraordinary accomplishments had spread throughout the Meridian Alliance and beyond. Statues were erected in her honor on 17 different worlds. Some of them were enormous, towering structures made of crystal or metal, depicting the old woman holding her rolling pin high in the air. Others were smaller, more intimate sculptures that captured her in a moment of quiet contemplation. Every statue told the story of how one person, armed with courage and determination, had changed the course of history. The alien species that had once mocked her now spoke of her with reverence. Commander Krell gave speeches about her brilliance. The crystalline beings composed harmonic frequencies in her honor. The Catharian government declared her a hero of their people. Universities across galactic space wanted to study her. Military academies began teaching courses dedicated entirely to her tactics, teaching new generations of officers how to think like Margaret Chin, how to see weaknesses that others missed, how to make the hard decisions that separated victory from defeat. The honors came continuously. The Meridian Alliance offered her a permanent position as chief military strategist. The Catharian government offered her the title of honored advisor with authority over multiple sectors of space. The crystalline beings offered her the chance to join their council as a voice of wisdom. The human government on Earth offered her a cabinet position, a seat on the United Nations Security Council, a role in shaping Earth's future in galactic politics. Military leaders from across known space wanted her to consult on their strategies, their tactics, their defense systems. Margaret refused almost all of it. "I just want to go home," she said simply when they asked her to become a permanent military advisor. Her voice was tired but firm. "I've done what I came here to do. Now I want to go home." The Meridian Alliance tried to convince her to stay. They offered her palaces to live in, servants to attend to her needs, anything she could possibly want. But Margaret was unmoved by the offers. She had come to space to help, not to build an empire for herself. She had come to do what was necessary, not to become powerful or famous. The fame and the statues were things that had happened to her, not things that she had pursued. "You have saved our entire civilization," said the leader of the Meridian Alliance, a being named Theron who represented the interests of all the member species. "You have given us back our lives, our worlds, our future. Surely you would consider staying at least for a time?" "No," Margaret said not unkindly. "I'm old. I'm tired. I miss my home. I miss my family. I've done what was necessary. Now it's time for others to take over. It's time for me to go back to my life." The Meridian Alliance provided Margaret with a transport ship of her own, the finest vessel that human technology could appreciate. It was equipped with every comfort that could be imagined. But Margaret only requested one thing: a good bed, comfortable chairs, and enough food to last the journey back to Earth. As the ship prepared for departure, officers and leaders from various species came to say goodbye. Commander Krell clicked his mandibles, and what Margaret had learned was a sign of respect and affection. The crystalline being hummed a frequency that the translation device converted into words of thanks and gratitude. Officer Patricia hugged Margaret, tears streaming down her face. "You changed everything," Patricia said. "You changed how we think about strategy, about leadership, about what it means to be brave." "I just did what needed to be done," Margaret replied, hugging the younger woman back. "That's all anyone can do." The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks. Margaret spent most of that time in her cabin, watching the stars pass by, thinking about what she had experienced. She had left Earth as an angry old woman looking for a place to channel her frustration. She was returning as someone who had truly made a difference, someone whose actions had mattered in ways that most people could never achieve. But she didn't feel different inside. She was still the same Margaret Chin who had read that distress message on her computer screen in Vancouver. She was still angry about suffering and injustice. She still believed that the strong should help the weak. She still thought that sometimes, doing what was right meant taking risks and accepting consequences. When Earth came into view, Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She was home. After weeks away, after traveling through space to an alien war, she was finally home. The landing created a frenzy of activity on Earth. The government had arranged a massive welcome celebration. World leaders wanted to meet her. Military strategists wanted to study her tactics. Television stations and news organizations wanted interviews. The entire world seemed to want a piece of Margaret Chin, the elderly woman who had saved an entire galactic civilization. Margaret gave one press conference, standing at a podium with her rolling pin resting on the surface in front of her. She looked out at the cameras and the reporters and the crowds, and she spoke simply. "I'm not a military genius," she said. I'm not some extraordinary person with special abilities. I'm just an old woman who got angry. I saw people suffering and I decided to do something about it. That's all. There's nothing special about me. What's special is that we tried and we didn't give up and we won. That's what matters. That's what any of us can do, if we're willing to take the risk and accept the consequences. She answered a few questions, but she kept her answers short and simple. Then she walked away from the podium and refused to give any more interviews. She had said what she needed to say. Now she wanted to go home and live her life. Her daughter Elizabeth was waiting for her at her small house in Vancouver. Her grandchildren ran out onto the porch and hugged her, careful not to knock her over with their enthusiasm. Margaret held them close and felt, for the first time since she had left Earth, that she was truly home. This was what mattered. This was what was important. Not the statues or the titles or the fame or the military honors. Just this. Just her family. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for a woman who had just become the most famous person in galactic history. Margaret went back to her garden. She planted vegetables and flowers. She cooked dumplings for her family, using techniques that had been passed down through generations of Chen women. She read books and watched the news and lived the quiet life of a retired schoolteacher. But in her kitchen, hanging on the wall next to a photograph of her late husband, was the old wooden rolling pin. It was stained with marks from her adventures across the stars, and it served as a daily reminder of what one person, armed with courage and determination and a willingness to do what was necessary, could accomplish. In the evenings, when her grandchildren would visit, they would ask her to tell them the story of how she had saved the galaxy. And Margaret would smile and pull out the rolling pin and tell them about the void swarm and the strategy and the moment when she had hit the massive alien creature with her grandmother's kitchen tool. But Grandma, her youngest grandchild, a boy named Henry, asked one day, "Weren't you scared?" Margaret thought about that question carefully. "Yes," she said honestly. "I was terrified. I was more scared than I had ever been in my entire life. But I was more angry about the suffering than I was scared of dying. And sometimes, being angry is more powerful than being scared. Sometimes, anger can push you to do things that fear would never allow." The Earth's sky had changed in the years since Margaret's return. Catharian ships from the Meridian Alliance now passed overhead regularly, along with vessels from other alien civilizations. Human ships traveled out to explore the stars and establish trade agreements and build partnerships. Humanity had moved from being a curiosity in galactic society to being respected allies and partners. Trade agreements had been established. Cultural exchanges had begun. Educational programs had been created where young people from Earth could study with aliens and vice versa. And it had all begun because one angry grandmother had decided that she was done watching other people suffer. She had picked up her rolling pin, boarded a transport ship, and refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. On clear nights, when Margaret sat on her porch and looked up at the stars, she could see the light from distant worlds, from the places where the Meridian Alliance had rebuilt what the Void Swarm had destroyed. She could see the faint lights of ships traveling between worlds. She could see the evidence of a galactic civilization that was rebuilding, that was healing, that was learning to trust and work together. And she smiled, knowing that her anger had finally been useful. Knowing that her determination had mattered. Knowing that in the end it had all been worth it. The story of the angry grandmother and her rolling pin would be told for centuries to come, passed down through generations of humans and aliens alike. It would be taught in schools and universities. It would be studied by military strategists. It would inspire people to believe that one person, no matter how old or how small or how ordinary, could make a difference. It was a story of courage. It was a story of determination. It was a story of what humanity could accomplish when we refused to accept defeat. It was a story of one woman who decided to change everything. Anne Margaret Chin, 78-year-old retired schoolteacher from Vancouver, lived out the rest of her days in peace, surrounded by her grandchildren and her garden, knowing that she had done something that would matter forever.